everybody, welcome to your next Writer's Toolbox video. This one will cover dialect, vernacular, and slang. It's going to give you terms, but also new ideas as how you can use voice for different characters. You're going to be writing multiple pieces about the same experience or event from multiple perspectives, and therefore learning about how to create unique voices is going to be very helpful because it's not just about how the narrator thinks, it's about the way that they speak. So let's take a look so that you can understand what I mean by that. So the first thing is dialect, and so dialect is kind of the most overarching term. This is the biggest term we're going to look at, and it's a particular form of language that is peculiar to a specific region or social group. So if we take a look at this map, we can see that dialects span pretty large chunks of area, and we can see all the different dialects that exist in the U.S. So for instance, where we live, we have coastal Southern, but if you go a little more far west, you enter Southern Appalachian, and if you've ever been to that part of the U.S., you will detect a difference in speech pattern. So dialect has a lot to do with accent, but it also has to do with syntax. It's about both the way that we say words and also how we organize them in sentences. So I can't play this video within my video because it would sound very funny. However, I've also posted the slides for this video and I highly encourage you to go watch this video. What it does is it shows dialects from different regions. It shows the state that the person is from and then has 4 different people say the same word from 4 different states. It gives you a great example of what dialect is. I highly recommend watching it. So dialect is our largest kind of term that we're looking at, and vernacular is a subterm to that. And a lot of times these words are used interchangeably, but they actually are different words. So what vernacular is, it's not the difference in the way people say a single word, it's differences in how people use a single word. So for instance, the vernacular of the word pie. Now we all know pie is a delicious thing that we eat, but it's also used in different ways, such as cutie pie, pie in the sky, humble pie, pie piece, and pie-eyed. So in different parts of the United States and the world, these forms of pie are used, and that's vernacular. All right, they're phrases or word pairings or just simple words that are used in different ways. So for instance, I know the term cutie pie, but I've never heard of the term pie-eyed because it's not part of my vernacular. So if you look here, vernacular is the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people in a particular country or region. Ultimately, this definition makes vernacular seem synonymous to dialect. It actually lists dialect underneath the synonyms. And if we look at this comparison, it says they both refer to the common language spoken by people in an area, a group, or a profession. Dialect tends to also include the accent with which some people speak, in addition to the vocabulary and grammar. Vernacular is sometimes used in that way, but more often it just refers to the differences in language and grammar. So again, we can see how these words are oftentimes used interchangeably, and we'll have to acknowledge that in discussion and also when you learn about it by looking at the web because you'll see them used interchangeably. But what you need to take away from that is dialect heavily has to do with accent in the way that people say the same words in different ways, but also how people would say the same sentences in different ways. While vernacular has more to do with the specific words that people use and how they use words differently. So for instance, a really good example is soda, pop, Coke, and soft drinks. So this is not the same word that sounds different due to an accent. That would be dialect. These are people all referring to carbonated beverages in different ways. Some people say soda, some people say pop, some people say Coke. Some people say soft drink, but I've never actually heard that. So it's the idea that based upon your vernacular, you're going to select a different word to refer to the same item. So for example, in the U.S., 3 different types of vernaculars, there's so many, include Appalachian Vernacular English, African American Vernacular English, also known as Ebonics, and Tex-Mex Vernacular. So depending on where you are in the U.S., between these vernaculars and the many other vernaculars that exist in the U.S., people are going to select different words to say the same thing. And those differences in words is what vernacular is. So let's look at some examples. And it's all for me grog, me jolly, jolly grog. So this is Irish vernacular in a folk song, and folk songs are normally written in vernacular because they're songs of a specific area representing the people. And this one has a couple of very Irish touches. For instance, the word me replaces the word my. So this has nothing to do with accent. This is a different use of a specific word, where some people would say my, but in this vernacular, people say me. Now with the word grog, I would argue that that's a slang because grog does not, well, actually maybe not. So the word grog refers to beer. So some people would say beer, some people would say grog. I don't know any other vernaculars for beer because they just call it beer. But it's the idea that it's a word that's a different word that means the same thing as words used in other vernaculars. Let's look at this one. Say who is you? Where is you? Dog my cats if I didn't hear something. Well, I know what I's going to do. I's going to sit down here and listen till I hears it again. So here in this excerpt from Huckleberry Finn, we have both dialect and vernacular. So for instance, the dialect in something and goina, that's something and going to, but the accent changes the way that it's said. However, if you look, dog my cats, that's vernacular, and that's not in my vernacular. I don't know what that means. However, in the location and time of this book, dog my cats meant something to that vernacular. Alright, so now let's talk about slang. So slang, basic, can't, ship, can't even, slay, shade, yes, preach, slay, fam, turn up, not turnips, turn up, basic, okay. All these are slang. And what you need to know about slang is that slang is very similar to vernacular, but the difference is it's just a word that's made up. So the idea is that bae was never a word that existed before. I think it's maybe a shortening for baby. I think that's what that is. So it's the idea that slang can be the shortening of a word that's then used throughout a group of people. However, slay is a word that existed before. However, the meaning of slay has been completely changed. Slay means to kill someone pretty violently, but in the slang used today, slay means to do something really, really impressively well. Very different. So think of slay as either being a word that's just been made up, a word that's been shortened, or a word whose meaning has been significantly changed. That's slang. So slang, also known as colloquialisms, is the vernacular, again confusing because they use these words interchangeably, of a particularly group, especially a youth subculture like punk or hip-hop culture. Colloquialisms are highly informal and should always be avoided in formal writing. So please don't use slang and colloquialisms in your writing, except you're in creative writing. So use it in your writing because it will help create voice. So use it, but not in your English classes. So keep in mind that slang is something that belongs to a group of people, like a subculture, while vernacular belongs to a group of people of an area, similar to dialect, except usually dialects are a larger area. Alright, this is the last thing that we're going to look at, and what this table that you should definitely use will allow you is to think about how your character should speak. Should your character use bombastic language? And that's high-flown, pompous language where a person is purposely using words in a very difficult and confusing manner so that they are essentially above others. And that's out of the norm. It's not a norm to make people feel bad about how they speak. So bombastic would be used by someone who's very arrogant, essentially, and self-important. The next we have is special literary, which might be used by a character who's a professor or a scientist, somebody very, very, very well educated, and is considered lofty, elevated, highly literary, poetic, learned, bookish, formal speech. So this is somebody who goes to the library a lot. And so it's considered the exalted norm. And the reason why it's called that is because this is what people who are concerned with education, and they shoot for this kind of language, especially when they're writing things like theses or books that they want to get published. And so, for instance, in this, you would see the language patterns of inter, precipitate, amplitude, demerit, decorus, espouse, rudiment, steed, blah, 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 blah. All of these are words that not everyone's going to know. It's not common language. It's elevated. So would your character use that kind of language? Next comes standard English, and we have two forms of standard English, the common literary and the neutral. So standard English common literary is what you're going to use, for instance, in high school and college. So if your character uses this, it's the idea that they're going to be in a professional or an education setting, and therefore they're going to be using language that's going to get them a good grade or respect from their peers, or essentially presents themselves in the way that they want to be seen because of their desires as the character they are. And it might be eliminate, assign, allocate, fabricate, concoct, assist, continue, initiate. So while this is a basic norm and considered standard, it is a little more elevated. Again, these are not going to be words that everybody knows. Now when we move to standard English neutral, again, this is another basic norm, but this is going to be language that you wouldn't necessarily see in a professional setting nor necessarily an educational setting. However, you would definitely see this in common conversation between people. Destroy, budget, earmark, invent, make up, help, proceed, begin, start. So this is not very formal. It's not necessarily informal, that's why it's called neutral, but these are words that most people have access to. Maybe not earmark, because that's a bit of a slang, but these words most people know. Now we're going into kind of outside the norms, and we're going to talk about why. So here we have common colloquial, and remember that colloquial is another word for slang. And this is considered literary colloquial or informal. And it's a possible norm because depending on where you work or where you go to school, some of these terms are going to be allowed to enter into your writing and your speech to other people, such as wreck, dump, set aside, trump up, mummy, daddy, dorm, chap, rubbish, dock, to shut, to poo-poo, to snuff it. What you're going to notice that a lot of these are slang, colloquial. So it's the idea that this is what the type of language that you're going to use with your friends, maybe your family, but this isn't going to be the kind of language that hopefully you would use when giving a speech to an audience. So while it's a possible norm, it's called a possible norm because it's normal in conversation with certain people. It depends on the context of the situation. So what you want to ask yourself is your character the kind of character who would use common colloquial in instances that other people would approve of, or would they use common colloquial in instances that people might not approve of? Are they going to get up and give a huge speech using a lot of slang? Because that helps us define who this character is. Are they a rebel? Are they someone who wants to make a difference outside of what's considered the norm? So something to consider. Next we have special colloquial, which is a familiar colloquial. It's also called local colloquial, which is a bit of a pejorative. I'm not a big fan of that description, but it's considered outside the norm. And so the examples here is, for instance, calling a girl like a little girl, a bundle, a duckling, a fluff, a plaything, which is a little creepy, but I've actually heard kind of like grandparents, oh, your little plaything. Still creepy. Sugar, cookie. I'm not really a fan of any of these terms, but darling maybe, but it's the idea that these are slang terms that are used to describe girl. And so there's so many slang terms. And the reason why they're considered out of the norm is because to some people, they would be considered insulting. If somebody called you a plaything or a duckling or a fluff or a cookie and you got mad at them, that would be understandable, okay? So special colloquial is interesting because we do hear it out of a lot of people based upon where they come from. They don't find that term insulting, but other people do find that term insulting. Or because they're part of a certain group, they don't find a word insulting, but another group finds the word insulting. So that's going to be special colloquial, and it's considered out of the norm because some people find it offensive. And you got to consider if your character is the kind of character who uses special colloquial, and are they the kind of character who uses around people who would be insulted by it. So think about that. And the last one is vulgar. And I don't have any examples because these are the rude, taboo, four-letter words that are very much out of the norm, kind of across speech patterns. So no matter where you are in the vernacular, dialect, slang, you're going to know that vulgar words are vulgar. So you want to consider if you have the type of character who's going to use vulgar language. So this table is excellent because it gets you to start thinking about where your voice is going to fall, how your character would speak, and what kind of words they would use. All right, I hope this has been helpful. Good luck with your writing. Bye.